The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Well, welcome everyone. We started our new book reviews 4 years ago. One of our very first ones was Rose here, who came. We only had half the room closed off, no TV. It was back in the first starting out. Now, Rose is the author of this book, Kimchi and Calamari. It's what we call a young adult novel, YA novel. She has 2 more finished, but the publishing process takes so long. You may have seen me interview her on our TV station. So I have to say that I knew Rose would come and do another book review, but I knew she would say yes no matter what the book was. But when I told her, well, this book is about West Point, and I know when she went to Annapolis, I said, this book's about West Point. It's written by someone who teaches there. I think she hesitated for a little bit, but she did decide to do it. And she's a Navy veteran. She was in one of the first classes to admit women at Annapolis. And the book, which I finally had time to read before the new book review, is a very interesting book. It's called Soldier's Heart, Reading Literature Through Peace and War at West Point, and the author has been teaching English at West Point for 10 years. So here's Rose Kent to tell us about this book.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everybody. It's nice to see everybody here. As Joe shared with you, I am an author, and I feel I have a special connection with this book. Here it is, for those of you who might not have seen it yet, Soldier's Heart, written by Elizabeth Hammett, just came out last year. And I feel a special connection with the book for a few reasons. But first, because I am an author. Samet writes for adults. I write for children. My age group is 8 to 12. And as part of being a writer, I get the joy of going into schools and talking to children about writing and reading. And it's interesting because I often tell kids when I speak to them, I refer to C.S. Lewis, who kids know because of the Chronicles of Narnia. And I repeat his quote, "We read to know that we are not alone." Kids really connect with that. I tell them that we can read and write during the hard times of our lives as well as the easy times. And it's really a way we can connect with each other, solidarity on the planet. And it's interesting because certainly Elizabeth Samet feels that way. And in fact, she quotes C.S. Lewis as well in her book. And I really like seeing that, and I really appreciate what she does for those West Point cadets through literature. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about myself, just to put my comments in context. And then I'll go in and explore some of the different themes in Soldier's Heart. There's so many. Of course, we can't touch on all of them. But I'll talk about a few of them. Please feel free to raise your hand at any point with a question or share a thought. And if I don't get to whatever you would like to hear about in the book, I'm happy to do that at the end. We'll open it up for general discussion. So I'll start with myself, and I'm going to show you my picture here from when I was at the Naval Academy. I know, way back in 1984. I know. My 12-year-old son said, "Are you really going to show that picture, Mom? The hair. When I was at the Naval Academy, your hair as a woman could only go to the top of your collar. And if it was any longer than that, you got in trouble. So, and of course, the women were always pushing the boundaries. We were always trying to let it grow a little longer. Has anybody here been to the Naval Academy in Annapolis? Anyone? Okay. Not yet. Okay. The Naval Academy is in Annapolis on the shores of the Severn River. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And the academy itself is a national park. So if you ever get a chance to go down to Maryland, I highly recommend it because you can do a tour and you'll see the midshipmen walking around, and it's very enjoyable. So I started at the Naval Academy when I was 17 years old. I was 12 days out of high school. I grew up on Long Island, went to high school on Long Island, and my parents are here today. That's my father, Harry Kent, and my mom, Teresa Kent, on the end, and my son wedged in the middle. And I share that because, thank you. Now, there was a diversity of opinion in the house, if you would, about whether I should go to the Naval Academy. When I told my parents I was thinking about doing this, and women had just started going, my father voted by immediately putting a Navy ball cap on and walking around with that. So I knew how he felt. My mother started taking her rosary beads out more often and praying that I, in fact, would not go. But I did go, and like many of my classmates, men and women, I chose the academy because of the challenge. and I really thought a lot about it. It was also a 4-year full scholarship, which was very nice. And I was attracted to the service, serving our country, serving the Navy, which is the requirement, because after you graduate from the Naval Academy, and all the academies, of course, you serve as an officer for 5 years. A lot of people will ask me, even to this day when they find out that I went to the academy, what that experience was like. When I actually went there, we started with about 1,100 in my class. Most of that men, probably about 100 women starting out, and we graduated with 52. And when people ask me what that experience was like, I think about literature, not unlike Elizabeth Samet in this book. When I quote Dickens in his classic A Tale of Two Cities, I always say it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. But I mean that lightly and favorably, because I have terrific memories from the Naval Academy. It taught me a lot to cope with my life and things that happened after the academy. But of course, like anybody who goes to a service academy, I found it to be tough. It certainly wasn't 4 years of studying or partying. Midshipmen, as we're called at the Naval Academy. West Point, you're called a cadet. Naval Academy, you're midshipman. You have to be in tip-top shape. You have to be able to run a mile run at a good pace every 6 months. You have to do an obstacle course. You have to jump off a 40-foot tower to simulate as if you were aboard a ship and your ship was going down. You have to be able to jump off that fully dressed. You have to swim so many laps in a pool, again, completely dressed as if you were dropped in the ocean. And you have to do enough laps to pass, and it's not a mild float in your back deal. Add to that, there's the military piece, marching in parades with fixed bayonets on very warm days once a week. There's all that yelling. You go in as a plebe and you get yelled at a lot. That psychological piece, a lot of that stuff. And on top of that, you have the academic load, which is primarily math and engineering courses, regardless of what your major is. But that, of course, is what we sign up for. Then I added to that being a woman, and women had been allowed to go to the academy, but they were not fully accepted yet. And yes, the politician said that the women could be there, but not everybody in the chain of command agreed with that. And they let it be known in subtle and not so subtle ways. Some of you may know Senator James Webb, newly elected senator from Virginia. He was actually a decorated Vietnam vet, best-selling author, and a faculty member at the Naval Academy at one time when we were there, first there, women. He also was the author of a very, very controversial article that was published when I first went to the Naval Academy. He was a Marine, and he wrote an article called Women Can't Fight. And he laid out very specifically why women can't fight and why they have no business being in the military. Well, as you can imagine, us women at the academy weren't very big on James Webb. But fortunately, women at the academies and in the service overall have come a really long way. And it really pleases me when I hear this, and that I hear that women are more mainstream now. And particularly that the opportunities are there for them in the operations. There were always the jobs there for them behind the lines, administrative. And even when I was there, the opportunities that were available for me were more administrative. But now, and to the women's credit, they're out there on the front lines and they're doing the job. And the reason that the women are so vital to the mission today in Iraq, in Afghanistan, is for one simple reason: we need them. So I guess I see 3 important distinctions between myself and the author that influence the way I read this book, Soldier's Heart. And the first is that Elizabeth Samet is a civilian and that I wore the uniform. And she's very clear about this from the first page. She came to West Point via a very elite private school in Massachusetts, and then she went to Harvard for her undergrad degree, and then Yale grad school. And she acknowledges, really, most of her contact with the military, the closest thing she came to it, was listening to the stories of her father, who served in the Army Air Corps back in World War II. But at the end of the day, Elizabeth Samet goes back to the reality of the classroom. That is her reality. The second distinction I see between myself and her is the times. I attended the Naval Academy during a time period of national peace. As I said, I graduated in 1984. That was right before prior to the Gulf War is when I actually got out of the service in 1989. And anybody who's been in the military will tell you that the peacetime military is night and day to wartime. And Samet, I think, does a really nice job of showing us that. How at West Point, things have changed so much from after 9/11 and after what's happened in Afghanistan. It's really transformed West Point. War is part of everyday life there now. Cadets have company mates, graduates ahead of them who are fighting and dying all the time. And it affects everything on the post. even how she teaches. And there's one line in the book that really kind of stayed with me on this note, is when she talks about who cadets often will say to her when they're trying to make a point of something that they're doing or studying, how insignificant it is. They'll say to her, "What's the difference, ma'am? In a year, I'll be in Iraq." So that's the second distinction. The last one, but I think a little more lighthearted, but every bit as important, has to do with who roots for Army and who roots for Navy. So, come December, many of you I know about the Army-Navy game. This is a very rich, long tradition that goes back over 100 years. And Elizabeth Samet, of course, roots for Army. They call themselves the Black Knights. I have to share with you that as a Naval Academy graduate, we do not call them the Black Knights.
Can you say what you call them?
I can say it, Joe, actually. I'm sure we've all seen The Wizard of Oz. And there's that great scene in The Wizard of Oz with the Wicked Witch when the flying monkeys come, you know, those mean monkeys that we all are afraid of, and they have those flaps. And when they fly, their flaps fly, and they're just so intimidating to look at. They reminded us of Army cadets, because the dress uniform that cadets wear has the same flaps. And they used to make a whoop sound when they were flying those monkeys. So we always call the cadets whoops. They really appreciate that, too. They call us squids, but who cares what they call us? You know, not that important. Anyway, I would like to point out to you at the end of 2007 that Navy has won the Army-Navy game 52 times. Army has won 49 times. And we've had 7 ties. So if you forget everything else that we talk about today, I highlighted the most important point, if you would remember that, to please go Navy, beat Army. Okay, thank you. So let's start with the book, and let's start with the title of the book. Here we go, just to give everybody a quick look at it again. Soldier's Heart. And Elizabeth Samet tells us that the term soldier's heart dates all the way back to the Civil War. And at the time, doctors were treating a number of soldiers who would come in. They were seemingly healthy soldiers, but they would come in with these symptoms of cardiovascular disease. And you know, back then, little was understood about psychological problems, or what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder today. And instead, the soldiers were said to be simply suffering from this irritable heart. That's what they would call it. And you know, from there, Samet discusses a little bit about the whole idea of a soldier's heart, or the dilemma of a soldier's heart, or what the expectations are for soldiers to be, you know, all heart, and yet to have no heart at all. And she refers to a great line from Shakespeare, Henry V, "Steel my soldier's heart, steel, S-T-E-E-L." And Samet feels it's no wonder today that we see this dilemma with some of our soldiers and our officers, this conflict to do the military job, and yet at the same time, you know, stay as stones in the battle, but yet also to be sensitive and to be ethical and moral citizens. Kind of a tough dilemma if you're in the business of war, isn't it? But what I like about this book is that she is very hopeful, and she paints a promising picture for us of future officers who really do this. They do walk that line between being a citizen and a soldier. And she says of them that they are not just students of literature or numb soldiers, but citizens willing to make sacrifice. And she goes on to talk about this whole idea of being a soldier citizen. And she starts talking about the year 2005. She calls it the year of the plague. And it was a tough year, especially when she puts it in the context. You know, for starters, the country's reeling from the war going badly after President Bush boldly proclaimed mission accomplished. Do we remember that? Yeah, it wasn't quite accomplished, though. And then she shares a story about the building where she works in at West Point, literally the roof being blown off, you know, and then all that disturbing news that comes down, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, the climbing death toll, American soldiers, citizens in Iraq. And then she tells 2 short, very sad stories about faculty, former faculty at West Point, who have been killed. The academies often do this. Much of the faculty is actually active duty officers that will take a break. You know, the Naval Academy, they'll come in from the fleet, they'll do 2 or 3 years at the academy and then go back. So she really gets to know the officers who are there. And his first death was a colonel who had committed suicide in a trailer in Baghdad when he just couldn't reconcile his own view about what honorable service is with what he was seeing there. And he was seeing a very kind of shaky role of the private contractors. He was seeing a lot of money changing hands. And even the nature of the mission, he couldn't take it, so he killed himself. The second death was a major who had also been on faculty and whose HUM-WV actually rolled over on an IED in Iraq. So it's a really tough year for her. It's a tough year for her students. And then you add to this, you've got these national disasters going on. You know, you had the tsunami that hit, remember, around Christmas, and the earthquakes, the hurricane, this horrible flu epidemic, and you can see why she calls it the year of the plague. So as an English professor, Elizabeth Samet does a really smart thing. She seizes this feeling, and she starts having her students study Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, which looks at the plague that hit London back in 1665. And she has them study Homer's Iliad, the epic Greek poem about the siege of the city of Troy. And she really makes them think and relate what's going on in those texts to what's going on in the world, suffering, sickness. And she really uses every opportunity in her class to do this, to make her students think about war and peace and battle and this whole myth of that citizen soldier. And I also think she has them study Homer as a way of connecting, again, making them realize that they are not alone, that, you know, soldiers that came before them had similar struggles, ethical questions. And I really like that. I really like that she challenges her class and she really makes them think about this citizen soldier. And she gives us some really nice examples about how these young men and women are doing just that. In the beginning of the book, she talks about these three students. She calls them the Three Musketeers, 2 men and 1 woman at West Point. And she tells us they come from different backgrounds and their motivations are different. But ultimately, you get the sense that there's a real solid decency about these young people and that they are nurtured by the literature that they study together. I actually wanted to hear more about them. I don't know if anybody else felt that way. We were introduced to them early in the book, and I really would have wanted to know more about their journey as they entered into the Army. But of course, with the mission at hand, it's probably very understandable that they couldn't keep that connection up with their English professor. Elizabeth Samet also talks about attending an event with her parents. I think it might have been an award her mother was receiving, and when her parents' friends hear that she teaches at West Point, they make kind of a half joke about, you mean they read at West Point? You know, they make that smug comment, and she makes the point to us, the reader, very clear. Yes, that they do read, not only at West Point, but then she goes on to give us many examples of emails and letters that she gets from her former students now deployed in the Middle East. And that's very encouraging to me, too. I really like that vision of knowing that there are officers out there on patrol, you know, in harm's way, and they still find time to read and reflect on what they're reading and how it connects to their lives and to the world. I did wonder, though, I'll have to be honest with you, you know, Samet doesn't give us statistics, who's reading, what they're reading. Obviously, she doesn't have those numbers, but I am curious, and I wonder if it is the majority of officers who are reading over there so voraciously, or if it is the minority. Because we live in a society where we all know there aren't 2,000 people in this room. You know, all the numbers will tell us that people aren't reading as much as they were. But I'm glad to see that, in fact, some are. So the next section that Samet talks about is this whole idea of, at West Point, of the soldier and the student. Kind of this push-pull at the academy. And I think she does a really nice job showing us this tension. She describes that some of the higher-ups, if you will, really see cadets as future officers. So it's really not important what they know, but that they obey. And clearly, her point of view as an educator is different. You know, she really wants her students to develop, to be critical learners and thinkers. And she quotes the Secretary of War going back to the year 1802, John Armstrong, who supposedly was very angry and reacted to news that he'd heard about cadets who were reading history books. And this is what he said: "Ah, such books, luxuries of leisure, the mushrooms and truffles of literary sensualists." And then she tells us again a little more recently, the late David Hackworth, who was a highly decorated Vietnam officer, you know, also became a very fierce critic of the academy and the direction it was taking with its studies. And one of his beefs was that books and officers do not make good bedfellows. And Samet writes, he believed that the practice of teaching poetry at West Point succeeded only in producing more of what he called the perfumed princes who lost Vietnam. Now that's a thought, isn't it? And I can't help to wonder sometimes if we would have had more military and civilian decision makers reading, if that not might have helped in that difficult time for our country. Well, obviously, Samet disagrees with this point of view and conducts her classroom accordingly. And judging by the officers who write to her and email her from the Middle East, who are eager to share with her what they're reading and how it is helping them cope, she feels that literature is beneficial to this citizen soldier. And she gives an interesting example to back this up when she recounts the story of a West Point officer in Kabul who shared an appreciation for the poet Rumi with this Afghani colonel he was working with. Rumi was a poet who lived in the area that is now Afghanistan back in the 1200s. And his poetry wasn't about war, it was all about love. It was about love and peace. So this American officer tells Samet that in talking with this Afghani colonel about Rumi, he forged this really nice connection that really helped them work together. And Samet makes a good point that she thinks so many other cultures around the globe, they know their literature more than we do as Americans. It's just a nice connection. And finally, to also support this connection between literature and thinking, Samet refers to West Point's founders, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were very keen on instilling civic responsibility as well as the technical skills an officer needed. And they were also a little suspicious of military autocrats. They really wanted to get their point of view in there. Any questions or comments so far? I know I'm covering a lot of ground here. Everybody okay? The next section of the book says weapons. I really like this piece. Samet talks about the importance of helping soldiers have access to books. And she talks about a number of organizations that actually do that right now, that they ship books over to our soldiers. And I think it's here that she shares one really wise piece of insight in the book when she talks about the role that reading and a reader's life can play in this for a soldier. And I'll read her quote. "Over the past several years, I've come to understand the many ways in which books can serve as weapons against boredom and loneliness, obviously, against fear and sorrow, but also against the more elusive evils of certitude and dogmatism." I can't help to hear C.S. Lewis's voice again here. We read to know we're not alone. I shared with you that I write for children and that I go to schools, and when I'm in the schools, I talk a lot about the role of reading and writing and the importance. And I can't tell you how many kids will stop me afterwards, especially if it's just me, and they'll share a story about it. And I was just at a school last week, and I was sharing that the role reading and writing has played in my life in dealing with difficult times. And a boy stopped me afterwards. He must have been about 12. And he told me that his cousin had been killed less than 6 months ago in a very, very awful, tragic car accident. He was literally thrown from the car. It was a really hard time. And he said he cried, and he cried for months, and anyone who would listen, his friends, his family, it poured out of him. But it was still coming. The pain was still there, and there weren't enough ears. And he felt like some of his friends were getting tired of listening. But he said the page always showed up for him, and he could put his thoughts down on the page. And when he read others about other struggles, it comforted him. And again, we read to know we're not alone. In the next section of the book, Elizabeth Samet talks about women in the service. So I really perked up at this point, you know. Put my cookie down and my cup of tea, and I read carefully. Frankly, I think this might be one of the less strong sections of the book. Again, Elizabeth Samet comes to this at a time that women have been there. You know, I started at an earlier time. And she's not really fazed by the fact that she is in the minority as a woman in the English department. She works primarily with men in this very male-dominated culture. But she's a teacher, so I think it's a little different. And she makes a point, she's almost a little bit dismissive about the fact that she chooses not to take on a mentoring role for women cadets. She doesn't really think it's necessary anymore. And she says that she doesn't feel she needs to be anybody's mother, nor that the Army would want her to be that. I think that's a fair enough point about mothering. You know, this is the military. But I can't help to think about 17-year-old women choosing the military combat as their career and what a unique position they're in. And I wonder if Elizabeth Samet wouldn't be a terrific mentor to some of these young women. Mentoring happens all the time at the service academies. If you're an athlete, you get a little bit of kind of a special break by fellow athletes, even if they're older than you. They have these tables, they call them tea tables. They're actually training tables. And if you're a plebe at the academy, you don't eat like a normal person. You know, your eyes have to be in the boat That means you have to look straight forward as you're eating, like this. You know, you can't be looking around. You know, you have to memorize a lot of information that at any point as you're eating, somebody can stop you and say, you know, Midshipman Kent, tell me what you read on the front page. Go. One article, and you have to be able to recite it quickly. It's not a normal experience, but if you're an athlete, you get to eat in a separate area where it's much more relaxed. Certainly people who are in certain clubs or activities mentor each other. Certainly people from the same state or hometown mentor each other. I think these are good things as long as they're not abusive. And I can't help to think that it would be nice for women to have more mentors at the Academy. And having stayed connected to some of my classmates who are women, we've often lamented that. You know, that when we went to the Academy, the message was, just get in there, shut your mouth, and act like you're a guy. Don't look for any special attention. And that's what we did. We kept our mouths shut. Sometimes things happened that were wrong, but we weren't going to cry. We weren't going to be like baby girls. We're going to keep going. But we didn't have mentors. You know, the women that were a few years ahead of us had been through an even harder time than we'd been through. And same thing, they weren't told to help out the younger women, and they didn't. But I think mentoring is a good thing. The next section is on obeying. And Samet reflects a lot here on the importance of obeying in the military versus the independent mind. She gives us an interesting example from history at Valley Forge, when George Washington's troops were very angry because they felt they were being treated poorly. They didn't have enough boots, they were freezing, they didn't have enough blankets, they didn't have enough, their uniforms weren't thick enough for the cold, and they wanted to write letters and complain to Congress. General Washington defended their right to do that. Some of the other officers thought that was unusual. And when he was trying to explain why he defended that right, this is what he said. Without that right, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to slaughter. Well, we all know this topic of obeying military orders has had a huge impact on history, don't we? Good and bad. We've seen it touch in a lot of ways. Samet talks about General Grant, West Point graduate himself, reflecting on this as well when he praised American troops after the Civil War as thinking soldiers. He said that they were better than any European soldiers because they not only worked like a machine, but the machine thought. And I like that. I like General Grant. You know, of course, though, there are the aberrations to this rule, and they can come to mind, and I'm sure you can even think of more. My lie is the first thing. Samet refers to it as the first thing I thought of when I read this section. But then there are the abuse incidents that have happened that we know about recently. You know, Guantanamo, Iraq. I find it really encouraging that Elizabeth Samet is at West Point having this conversation with our officers-to-be about obeying and what that means. And then in the next page I read, I also find it disturbing when she tells us that her students, in fact, share with her that they can easily understand how American soldiers grew to hate the Vietnamese civilians. They can understand that. They get that. They're not condoning what happened over there, but they can understand how that hatred grew. But at the same time, when they read Tim O'Brien, noted author, Vietnam vet, who asserts that he was more of a coward by going to fight in Vietnam instead of going to Canada, they're appalled by that. They're disgusted by it. I lived in the military culture for 9 years, 4 years at the academy, 5 years as an officer. Obedience is a high value. It's not a high value in our society if you think about it. You know, we Americans, we love renegades, you know, independent thinkers. Not so in the military. The military wants you to shut your mouth and get the job done. I share a light story with you that connects to this from my Naval Academy days. My first year there, again, I was a plebe. You know, you're at the bottom of the rung. You're nothing. You get yelled at by everybody. And accountability is huge. You really can't go anywhere on your own. You don't get free time. You don't get liberty. You have to be in your room at 9 o'clock at night. And you don't even go out in the hall unless you're going to the bathroom. You have no rights. Well, this particular day was during plebe summer, this tough boot camp summer. And I had 2 roommates. And we had had an interesting ethics lesson that day about an essay called A Message to Garcia. Anybody familiar with A Message to Garcia? Yeah, I think it was more popular in the first half of the 20th century, but it was basically written back in 1899 by Elbert Hubbard. And it's an essay that describes the incredible initiative of a soldier who needs to get a message to this other ensign named Garcia. And he just, you know, he literally climbs mountains to get it. Whatever it's going to take to get it done, he puts himself in harm's way. He is going to deliver that message, and he does. And, you know, basically at the end of the essay, the message to you, the reader, is, you know, don't ask questions. Just get the job done. Take initiative on your own. So here we were at the academy, plebes, listening to all this, stop asking questions, get the job done, and, yes, sir, we're listening. And we got back to our room that day. One of my roommates, my roommate Jackie from Chicago, got very sick, and she had to be taken to sick bed. So we're thinking about her. The upper class came in to check that everybody's in their beds because, the pressure of the Naval Academy, you don't want anyone going a little crazy and running out and going over the wall. So we're all accounted for. And my other roommate and I get to thinking, part of your job as a plebe is to keep your classmates up to date on what's going on. And, Jackie doesn't know what we heard today, and this is awful. We got to get this information to her. Message to Garcia. We got to get dressed and get out there and get it to her. Of course, we have no idea where sick bay is. Academy's big. It's a national park. And everybody, lights out. It's dark. It probably was close to midnight, but that's what we decided to do. We put our shoes on over our pajamas, and off we went. Message to Garcia. We were going to deliver this message. So, there we are wandering around the academy, completely lost. There's an interesting system of underground tunnels at the Naval Academy where the boilers and the electric work exists. Goes on for miles and miles. Midshipmen for decades have always called it the Ho Chi Minh Trails. So there we are, lost in this maze of the Ho Chi Minh Trails looking for our roommate. And now the upper class have figured out that we're not there. And they're thinking the worst. Because plebes who have had a lot of pressure have done a lot of things. The Severn River's right there. And they had one guy who jumped in the river and basically swam across the river to get out of the Naval Academy. So they're, really losing their mind. Well, eventually they found us about 2 hours later. And they were, after this full-blown manhunt. And they were dumbfounded. They just kept looking at us. What were you thinking? Where were you? And the two of us just kept looking at them saying, message to Garcia, sir. Fortunately, we didn't get penalized too heavily. We really did well there. We didn't get a lot of demerits over that one. Again, that culture of obedience, doing what you're supposed to do. I think Samet does a really fine job of showing us the dangers of obedience, though, when it's taken to an extreme. We've read the papers, especially about Abu Ghraib. Let me read her words to you. The American Army prides itself on the soldier's ability to recognize immoral or unlawful orders. I was just doing what I was told isn't a satisfactory excuse. That is why the abuses at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, for example, have been such a crushing betrayal to military professionals, especially those who teach ethics at West Point. So clearly you can see how this has affected her as an educator at West Point. I understand her point, and yet I also think that one could argue here that there were other factors going on besides blind obedience that led to those failures, including a relaxed, changed attitude about what constitutes torture and abuse, all the way from the commander-in-chief, as well as a general fatigue that our American troops have really dealt with, dealing with very difficult situations for long deployments, and as importantly, repeated deployments. They're not going once, they're going twice, some of them are going back now 3 times. I think much of that has resulted in the breakdowns there and terrible lapse of judgment. So the next section, Bibles and religious zealots. Samet gives us a chapter to discuss faith, or in her point of view, perhaps too much faith and not enough separation of church and state in the Army. Again, she refers to that rough year, 2005, the year of the plague, as she calls it, as a time when there's just this real crisis of faith. People doubting, people questioning, so much bad news. And she goes on to discuss the literature that soldiers are turning to during this time of lapse of faith. And she refers to T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, a triumph, something that became very popular with soldiers. And in fact, General Petraeus, ground commander in Iraq, is apparently a big fan of T.E. Lawrence. He's not only read it many times, but he has some of the text memorized. Well, I hadn't read the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, so I took a look at it. It's actually a memoir, and T.E. Lawrence, in fact, is Lawrence of Arabia. And it describes his whole experience while serving as a liaison officer with the rebel forces during this Arab revolt against the Turks back in 1918. And it shows how it kind of left him feeling bittersweet at the end. They end up losing, but also he ends up questioning himself whether he was the trickster or the one who was betrayed in the end. Not unlike the mixed feelings after Vietnam. Resurgence of the popularity of this text, and other texts like this, like War and Peace, Samet goes on again to assert that it shows soldiers struggling with faith of many different types, and really reaching for literature to help them cope in these tough times. Of course, this isn't new. We've seen this before. Soldiers throughout the decades have done this. C.S. Lewis again, we read to know we're not alone. But then from there, she goes on to talk a little bit about evangelism in the Army. And she's critical. She's critical that the officers in the chain of command are often using their position to promote their faith. She flat out says the Army is no place for evangelism. I think she makes a fair point here. We do have to have that separation of church and state. And I can recall moments in my own Navy life where that line might have been crossed. An upper class might have been very, very harsh on you, but all of a sudden, if that person was trying to bring you to their form of Christianity, they would pull you aside and suddenly be nice. Just didn't seem right. But at the same time, what I don't think Samet sees is, though, in fact, many soldiers who read in war zones are in fact reading their Bibles or the Torah or other religious-inspired stories. And I think that those stories very much sustain soldiers, as she believes that great literature does. Very much, because they're great stories too, whether or not you subscribe a faith to them. And I'll share an anecdotal story about my father-in-law, who served in the Korean War for 3 years, and how he's repeated many times that it was reading the Bible that his wife gave him that got him through that tough period. And he saw a lot of action in Korea, and in fact, he wore a crucifix, and he actually taped it around his chest in duct tape because he was behind enemy lines so many times. Just that sound of that jingling of the metal could have compromised him. But it was reading the Bible in bed at night is what helped him get through that period, sustaining that faith. So finally, we come to the last section of Soldier's Heart, and I think this is my favorite part of the book. I really enjoyed this, talking about the courage of soldiers and the reality of combat and the returning soldiers. And Elizabeth Samet repeats an excerpt from the West Point Cadet Prayer that she hears a lot on the grounds. Make us choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong. I'm going to repeat that again so you can really hear it. Make us choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong. What a great creed to live by, isn't it? And she shares a really wonderful story about a plebe at West Point who loses his hat. Those of you might remember it from the book, and how he's caught in this ethical dilemma because he's been in the classroom. Now he comes out of the classroom, he's one of the last to leave, and there's only one hat left on the rack, and it's not his. He turns it over to see if his name's underneath it, and it's not his. And the question is whether he should take it or not. Having been at the Naval Academy as a plebe, I can tell you this story is really powerful because going outside without your hat, which we called cover, by the way, you didn't call it a hat. You would get in trouble if you called it a hat. It was your cover. But you wouldn't dare go outside without your cover. It would be the equivalent of dancing naked. You just wouldn't do it. It would be so outrageous. You couldn't even leave your room. If you were inside your room, your dorm room, just to go out in the hall, to go to the bathroom, to go to another classmate's room, if you went out there without your cover on, you'd be dead meat. You'd be in so much trouble. So for this poor young man who comes out of his classroom, and there he is in an academic building quite a distance from his dorm, to realize that that's not his hat, the consequences would be huge. Certainly he would have a number of upper-class cadets in his face screaming at him on the way back. He would probably get sent to see a company officer and be chewed out there for not wearing his hat. And he'd certainly get demerits, which means he would be marching in the small little bit of free time that he had. So there he is confronting the situation, seeing the one hat, thinking about whether he should take it or not, and lo and behold, an upper class, an older cadet comes along and asks this plebe harshly, "What are you doing?" or "What's going on?" And he tells him the situation. "There's a hat here, sir, and it's not my hat." And the upperclassman tells him, "Oh, just take the thing and get out of here." But the new plebe, who's standing there, knowing what this means, says, "No, sir, because if he takes that hat, then the guy who forgot it won't have one." Courage, choosing the harder right instead of the easier wrong. I think this is never easy for anybody, but think back to when you were 17. It's really hard sometimes to do that, isn't it? And in the West Point world, think about those high stakes and how painful that would have been for that kid. Now imagine courage to choose the harder right on patrol in Afghanistan or Iraq, or guarding prisoners at Abu Ghraib when everybody else had bought into a new mentality. Later in the same section, Elizabeth Samet explores this whole idea of the Army being so masculine. and the draw to that, and how the battlefield death is often celebrated as the ultimate proof of courage. And then I go back to that example of that hat story, and I think about it as another way of showing courage. And I think she starts that chapter with the piece about the hat for a very clear reason. She also shows us a lot about the Army culture with physicality and being in shape and how important it is, and how that's really praised and seen as a value. I saw this too in my Navy days. Of course you had to be fit to be at the Naval Academy, but it was more than that. It was more than even a way of life. It was really held high as a value. And we hear the example of Teddy Roosevelt, good old Teddy, and how delighted he was with the young West Point officer who's been shot through the stomach. Literally, the bullet goes in one side of his stomach and out the other. And yet this officer insists he's all right as he's bleeding profusely. And this stamina, this sign of stamina, just absolutely delights Teddy Roosevelt. He loves it. He says, jolly ho, he loves West Point. Then later, Samet contrasts this with the example of General Grant again, a West Point grad, who gives us much to admire with his moral courage and his honesty, where he shares that he feared in battle, especially when he was young in earlier wars. And in fact, Samet makes a few references to Grant in his memoirs, and that made me want to return to that book. For those of you who have not read it, The Personal Memoirs of Ulysses Grant is just a fantastic read. Grant actually wrote that book not far from here. He wrote it in a cabin close to Wilton, and he was dying of throat cancer. It was a very difficult, painful death, and he was out of money. He wasn't a perfect man. We know he wasn't a perfect president, but he was a tough, smart, ethical general. And his memoir is very honest. He wasn't afraid to admit mistakes, and he speaks in a clear voice about amazing times, which Samet finds refreshing compared to some of the egotistical generals that she sees, although she's savvy enough not to name names. I mean, she's still on faculty. On this whole subject of courage, I really enjoyed Elizabeth Samet's reflections on a certain group of West Point cadets who she got to know and who were only a few years away from being shipped to Iraq. And she says this about these kids: "Those 16 plebes were the most interesting and the wisest people in my life that semester. They seemed to understand that courage isn't simply a matter of leading charges. Sometimes it consists of speaking up, sometimes in stoic silence, sometimes in forging ahead, sometimes in circumspection, and sometimes in nothing less than preserving our own humanity." I like that. Very end of the book, Samet describes soldiers returning from the war, facing the challenge of living with wounds that they wouldn't have survived in earlier wars, both physical and psychological. I know all of us have seen pictures of this in the news or heard stories on television about it. This part of the book was most touching for me, and it reminded me a little bit of that Tom Cruise film, Born on the 4th of July. How many people remember that movie? Yeah, very powerful. Vietnam vets coming back, struggling with lots of problems. And there's a powerful quote in her book from a sergeant at Walter Reed Hospital who complains that the amputees coming back from Iraq are really getting the lion's share of attention when those with post-traumatic stress disorder are really hurting just as badly. And referring to the amputees, this sergeant says this: "They can put a prosthetic on him and he's fixed. What can they do for me? Can't put prosthetics on our brain. I'm not fixed." And I think she shows us here the struggle, and we wonder, we can't help to wonder as a society and the military, are we doing enough? Are we doing enough for those returning men and women? Broken. Overall, I think that Elizabeth Samet leaves us with this real sense of respect for West Point cadets, these future officers. And we see them as really whole, more complex people. And they're hardly the machines of mindless violence that one might want to paint them as. And I think it's important that we get this from her. Because really, if you think about it, in the absence of a draft, we don't get to know the people who are fighting this war for us, do we? With a few exceptions, of course. But unfortunately, we get to know them when we see their faces on the cover of the newspaper after they died. I like how she gave us a little glimpse into their lives. And I also think that it's very clear with this book, Soldier's Heart, from the first page, that the students have taught the teacher that Elizabeth Samet is a changed person for having made this contact. Certainly a very different life she has from many others in academia who are teaching at an Ivy League school with many privileged young men and women. And I also think that she's right. At one point she says that, we can watch this war on TV, on CNN, but not really have a real sense of understanding. like she gets from the emails and the letters from the front line of young men and women reading poetry at midnight, and they have to go back on duty the next morning. So I've covered a lot of ground here. Overall, I think you can tell that I really enjoyed the book. I think it was a rich, thoughtful read. I think it opens our minds, regardless of how we feel about this war. And there's a final note that I want to make about it, because Samet, of course, talks about reading literature for the young military officers at West Point. But I think we can expand that and even the values of that citizen soldier and say that this might be a very good book for many people in training. And I was thinking along these lines and came across a book blogger online, and he was sharing that he actually teaches at medical school. He teaches future doctors. And he said the same logic that Samet applies to why it's important for our young junior officers to read literature also applies to our doctors, who, if you think about it, they're caught in a system where obeying becomes a high value too. Just go along, HMOs, just do what they say. And I think you can apply that same logic to judges, to lawyers. Think about some of the scandals, the struggles with our economy right now. You could apply it to business people, those giving out mortgages, and on and on. That is all I have right now. I would be happy to open this up and take some questions. Yes, sir.
I've never been to Annapolis, and naturally I hope to go soon. Do you have any suggestions? I mean, are there books, say, here in the library that would on the Academy, or?
Yes, there are. There are a number. Of course, you can get books about the Academy itself, or you can get books about the experience. I mentioned James Webb. He wrote a book, a fictionalized book about the Academy experience going back in the 1970s. I want to get the title for you correctly. I believe it's A Sense of Honor by James Webb. Interesting. There's also a wonderful book, I believe it's called The Nightingale's Song. It studies 4 Naval Academy classmates who were all in the class together, and I believe that was the class that Oliver North was in and James Webb was in. And it talks about how their lives varied and the different ways they went. So there were a number of really good books about the Academy experience. John McCain, having been a Naval Academy graduate, has a book about it. He was a little bit of a wild boy at the Naval Academy, from what the rumors say, even going back when I was there. But an interesting point of view he shares about the Academy.
Well, he was one of the 4 in the Nightingale song, too.
Was he? Yeah, thank you.
Oliver North, John McCain, and is it Poindexter? Somebody that was in the Reagan administration.
Yeah, I don't know if Poindexter was a Naval Academy guy, but it was right around the time of the Iran-Contra. I believe it was one of them. So that's a great book. I read it. I mean, that book's been around for about 12 years, I think, but it's a very good read.
And lastly, could you briefly give us a bio on your tour or your career after graduation?
Sure. Yeah, I've had a really interesting and varied career. As I said, I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1984. I took the oath of office and became an ensign, naval ensign. My first, now again, I referred to this, the time that I graduated from the Academy, the operational opportunities in large part really were not open to women. It was still a new time in the military. We were trying to figure out what to do with us. But I did take on the job as an ensign. I first was assigned to Washington, D.C., Naval Military Personnel Command. I worked in a really interesting division. It was the division where future flag officers, or the admirals in the Navy, were selected. And I got to work really doing a lot of running around and schlep work on that board, but it was a fascinating eagle's eye view of that process, to see the senior flag level officers in the service and what they used to assess who would get to the top. The other thing I did while I was in Washington was there's a terrific graduate school, Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and many officers want to go there, of course, and get their graduate degree, and then they go back out to the fleet. But, good old taxpayers have to be justified, and if Uncle Sam's going to pay for your graduate degree, somebody has to make sure that at some point in your naval career, you use that graduate degree in your tour of duty. So there I was in 01, an ensign, fresh out of the academy, 21 years old, and it was my job when people were trying to get their orders to go on to an exciting operational command job to say to them, I'm sorry, sir, you did not use your degree in business administration. They really liked that, So that was what I did for the first 3 years. Then I actually moved on to a joint command, a joint military command, stationed out of San Antonio, Texas, although deployed operationally all over the world. Again, this was prior to the Gulf War. But things were getting tense, and it was leading up to that. I had to have a top secret security clearance to work there. And it was interesting because it was almost like something you've seen out of the, you were not used to it. All the rooms were vaulted, and you had to know the combination literally to go from one room to the next, including the restrooms. And you had to have a special badge on. And if for some reason you didn't have your badge or you left your badge, it was not unlikely that, this was Air Force security at the time, they could stop you and jack you up if you didn't have that badge, because this was a little bit after the time that you had those serious spy cases. So I did a lot of primarily administrative things in that job, but I did have the privilege of, while I was stationed in San Antonio, being part of an electronic watch deployment group that went aboard the USS Iowa, which President Reagan had recommissioned. And it was a thrill. I was on the ship for 3 weeks. I was actually the first woman who ever was able to do that, because again, battleships were operational. Why would you have a woman on that? And up until the point that I literally stepped aboard on the Iowa, I met the ship in Kiel, Germany. And it was this crazy back and forth. Will she go? Will she not? There was all this fighting going on in the Navy about whether they would actually let me be on the ship for 3 weeks. So after we got through all that, and I did get to go on, and I was one of 6 officers on this. But it was a little awkward because all my fellow officers with me from San Antonio, they stayed in the main bunking aboard the ship. But again, because there were no women on the ship, they had to figure out what to do with Ensign Kent. So what did they do with me? They gave me the captain's guest cabin, which sounds all good and kind, but I think I shared with you about it. As a woman, all you wanted to do was get along, and you didn't want to have any special exceptions for you. So I felt actually a little awkward about it. So I was on the ship for 3 weeks, and the night before we were returning, now this particular ship had been deployed for 5 months. You know, sailors' wives had had babies while that ship was gone, and it was very exciting. They were coming back to Norfolk. And it had been a relatively smooth deployment, not too many problems. They had shut off the guns a few times, but we were coming in, and the night before, first let me back up first though, before I share this with you, let me tell you that there is an old wives' tale that women bring bad luck to battleships. Nobody told me that old wives' tale, but I wondered why I was getting some dirty looks from some of the senior enlisted. Until finally I went to the chaplain. You know, I said, is it just the whole woman thing? Is there something I need to know here, Commander? He said, well, I didn't want to tell you, Ensign, but there's an old wives' tale here that women bring really bad luck to battleships. So, of course, I'm from Long Island. I say, that is so stupid, Okay, so now we're coming back in from this deployment, and it's the night before. And, we're coming across on the Atlantic. We hit the worst god-awful storm that the U.S. Iowa ever encountered. And I kid you not that there are 40-foot swells out there. And I can remember being in my rack, because you call a bed aboard ship a rack. And, you don't have windows, you have the portholes, those round holes. And the water was shooting in. And it was coming in, and it was rising. Again, woman officer, I'm not going to go cry on anybody, woe is me. I'm thinking, well, maybe this is normal. What do I know? All of a sudden, the water's probably about 4 or 5 inches, and my rack is sliding back and forth in this little guest cabin. Finally, I thought, you know what, perhaps I should come out and see what's going on. It was late at night, and I went into the mess hall where you eat, and there was a terrific an enlisted man there, and he was mopping the floor. And I came over to him and I said, no problems here, just double checking. Is everybody taking in a little water? No, Ensign, nobody's taking in water. And he came over to my room and he helped me bail out a little bit. But I did do that. I served 5 years in the military. I didn't have a full career at it. When I was in San Antonio, I ended up having 2 of my 4 children. My son is here, TJ. And I'll blame TJ as part of the reason why I decided to move on and become a civilian, and I did. Ended up moving on and working in corporate America for many years before going off as an author. Any more questions or comments? How about hearing from you about the book and your thoughts on the book? Anybody not like the book? Anybody read the book? Okay, you did read it. I know Joe read it. I know my dad read it. What were your thoughts?
I read the whole thing yesterday. I couldn't put it down.
Wow.
Well, I had plans to read it, and then I just got caught up in it. The laundry nobody got any food, nothing. I just sat and read this book, and this was, I was an English major, so I really appreciated her. I closed this book and I said, God, what a wonder. If I could teach, that's what I would wanted to do. I had a fiance back in the 60s who died in Vietnam. And so I could understand a lot of what she was talking about, and tears came to my eyes. She's a really fine writer. And just, you know, you close the book and you say, if I'm a teacher, that's what I would want, because she gets feedback from this. You know, you regular high school or even college, very few come back and tell them, but she gets feedback from her students.
Mm-hmm.
She knows that she made an impact. She knows who she touched. And the other thing, what I really liked was when she mixed the books and the film. I mean, I thought that was really, really innovative. She knew who she was dealing with in terms of, you know, a visual generation. And also the way she grew up with war movies. My father was in the Army Air Force, and he was stationed at, he went to the Air Force Academy, the Army Air Force Academy at the time, and he went through World War II. And that's exactly what I grew up with. I know all the movies that she mentioned. I'm saying, I know this movie. It was some of my favorite movies. It was that and Westerns. That's what I grew up with. And black and white. When she talked about, you know, the black and white, who cares? That's what was in the house, so it didn't matter.
Yeah.
And it was just, this was an absolutely terrific book. I love this book.
Yeah.
I don't have anything negative to say.
Well, I'm going to say one of the best parts of the book, when she shares the excerpts from her students' writing, either their papers or when they leave and they write her back.
Yes.
I mean, they don't sound like the typical college students I see.
Yeah.
I don't know, they're not worried about going on spring break or something. They're really, I don't think they're typical college kids. They really, when she says in the beginning, oh, they read there, I mean, these kids probably read better and more carefully than most college students have seen.
Because the stakes are so high for them. She makes an interesting point about that, and she feels it's a gaffe on her part, and she's embarrassed afterwards, but she's reading a piece of literature written by somebody who takes a bullet through the neck, if you remember that section, and she says, well, of course, I don't expect anybody in this room to be writing something, you know, with that condition, and then she steps back and says, oh, dumb me. These kids are a few years away from that. So I think you make a great point about the real world. She really knows who these kids are and where they're going, even when she picks her text.
That was the other thing. You know, you go to public school, even private school, you know, there's these required readings. Some of it is horrendous. It drove me crazy when my daughter would come home. I would have to, we paid for private education, then she went to a public high school, and every time she came home, I'd have to undo the damage that was done in those schools. Well, I was a snob about, I mean, I was an English major at Brooklyn College, where they didn't stand for crap. You know, if you had to, you know, if you majored in English, you got a Harvard education at Brooklyn College, basically.
Yes.
And the text that she picks, she's sensitive to that. I mean, the book blew me away. I was, you know, I cried. I mean, tears came to my eyes as well. I mean, it was very touching.
It's nice to hear. For those who haven't read it, or for those who know somebody connected to the military right now, it is a terrific read. You know, those who may know somebody in active duty. Yes?
I think there are, way back in grad school, I had to do a paper on executive training or something like that, and there was back then, the Aspen Institute, that it doesn't really, I mean, you need to be a fairly high up executive to attend, but it's like a 2-week program in the summer, and they're sent a reading list, and then they kind of discuss a lot of the great novels and hopefully apply it to business practice.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah.
You know, I worked in corporate America. We didn't have much ethical reading going on when I was there, so it's not sure about people who are working mortgages these days.
I was going to say, I worked as a mortgage broker for 1 year after being in banking in Loudonville for 10, and the lack of, I mean, oh God, don't even get me, it is, I'm not at all surprised at what is going, the economic crisis. It's, you know, I sat there and thought, you don't need to be an economist to know this is wrong. Totally. And that was 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah.
It's very scary.
Yes, Sam.
I think one of the minor things that she does is reintroduce the American reading public to some of the great writers of World War I. Those who wrote against the trench warfare and the futility of the whole thing. they were very popular in the 20s and the 30s, and then kind of fell away from World War II on. And she's kind of bringing them back.
Yeah, I can't agree more. Her breadth of understanding literature and her familiarity with literature is humbling. She really does a great job with that.
Did you ever see her? I think Joe mentioned that on PBS or something, that there was a segment about her. Have you ever seen
Yeah, it was very good. She's also been on a number of the online interviews. You know, you can get audio interviews with her, and they're terrific. She's just down in West Point. I would hope one day I would love to meet her. Joe and I were talking about that, how old she was. Just doing the math from things she talked about, I think she said she was 7 or 8 back in the late 60s. So, no, I'm sorry, the early 70s. I think she's in her late 30s. Yeah, she is. Yeah, and she's still, in fact, at West Point. You know, she says in the book she no longer lives there. She lives in New York City. She wanted that, to be more of anonymous, not to be so much part of it. But she's still going strong teaching there, to her credit. Hopefully she'll write another book. I don't teach. I go into the schools and I do a lot of one-day workshops for children, middle school children. I go in the elementary school. I love to do that, and I work on my books. Okay, well,
Thanks for
thank you,
coming.
Joe. Thank you. You guys have been a great audience.